Hey kids, many thanks as always for tuning in. I am back. It's been a long and winding journey. I borrowed my sister's camera and it didn't really do what I needed it to do. I borrowed my stepfather's camcorder that only records in a single useless video format. I continued to muddle through the Sony message boards in hopes of finding some information that might help me with my problem. I sacrificed a goat at one point. Finally, I found a pre-repair contact option tucked away on the website of a Sony-approved camera repair company, and they gave me information that ultimately solved the problem. So things seem to be working fine now, but the moral of this story is Sony can eat a big old bag of dicks. Anyway, I have risen from the ashes like the almighty Phoenix to review the third book in k.a.applegate's Animorphs series, The Encounter. Book 3 centers around Tobias, whom I would coin the exile of the Animorphs team. At the beginning of the series, he was basically just the weird, scrawny kid at school that had a broken home life, and other than that, nobody really knew anything about him or cared to. I guess Jake at some point stopped some bullies from sticking his head in the toilet, and they've sort of maintained a casual friendship since then. But right up until that night at the construction site, he never really had any real connection to the rest of the team. And now, of course, ironically, he has a group of friends, but his status as boy trapped in the body of a hawk sort of leaves him permanently stuck as an outsider looking in. The Encounter was first published in August of 1996 by Scholastic, of course, and that's about 2 months after the second book in the series. Much like its predecessor, The Visitor, it does address some issues that go a little bit beyond just generic teen sci-fi fantasy stuff, and ultimately make it more interesting than I think the first book in the series. Now that being said, there's at least a handful of things in here that are pretty generic and even borderline stupid, but I'll get into that later. First, let's dive into the synopsis. Spoiler warning and all that, whatever, get over it. The Encounter opens with, of all things, an incredibly reckless scene in which Tobias, with Rachel's help, decides it's a good idea to potentially put his entire team at risk just to save a red-tailed hawk that's been caged by a local car dealership who's using it as an advertising mascot of sorts. He swoops in and undoes the cage while Rachel provides distraction by stomping through the very public parking lot as a fully grown African elephant. Nothing weird about that. It's rash and it's insane, and frankly, it doesn't really have that much impact on the rest of the story, though unlike the opening scene in The Visitor, it does at least get called back to a couple of times. That evening, while Tobias is out for a relaxing flight over the city, and catching the readers up on the whole Yeerk invasion and the morphing thing, he suddenly senses a huge presence in the air above him that he describes as a ripple in the sky. It's moving away from the mountains. He tries to follow it way too fast. So, instead, sensing this is probably something important, he heads back into town, meets up with the rest of the crew at Rachel's house. The rest of the team is pretty pissed about the dealership incident. Marco shouts for a while, Jake makes them promise never to do something so stupid again, and even Cassie, who views it as a noble cause, admits that it was pretty risky. But eventually everyone calms down, they go home. Tobias, for whatever reason, decides not to share the weird phenomenon he witnessed earlier that night, and he retires to Jake's attic, where Jake has misguidedly left out some leftovers that don't really mesh with a hawk's digestion. Tobias takes this time to do a little bit of reflection, talks about how he feels like the rest of the team kind of pities him for being trapped as a hawk. And while that's sad, he feels like his life's been sad ever since his parents died when he was just a little kid. At least now he can fly. The next day, Tobias heads back out to the city in hopes that he can spot the whatever it was that he saw, or didn't see, the day before, all the while reflecting on how he sometimes struggles with the hawk instincts inside of him. Eventually he does spot the huge ripple in the sky, this time headed toward the mountains, and in its haste, it takes out an entire flock of geese in flight, which, for whatever reason, it confirms in his mind that it is definitely a Yeerk ship. That evening, the team meets up at Cassie's barn to discuss Tobias' new discovery, and pretty much all agreeing that it's most likely a cloaked Yeerk ship of some kind, they agree that their next best plan is probably to head up into the mountains and see what it's up to. The next day, after school, the kids head up into the mountains and morph into wolves. I know what you're thinking. Wouldn't it be easier to just fly up there? Well, yes. But Tobias seems to think it might look a little suspicious to any, bird-watching Yeerks if they were to all fly up there in their various territorial bird of prey morphs. I guess a lot of Yeerks are just really into ornithology. Now, wolves are known for their distance running, so I guess the group figured it was the next best thing. But of course, Jake got to morph a male wolf. Marco lost a coin flip, so he had to stop and pee on something every 20 feet. I don't know why they didn't all just morph she-wolves, but whatever. Anyway, Tobias flaps up ahead to sort of scout things out, and notices a convoy of Parks and Rec vehicles moving up the mountain pretty quickly. And when they eventually reach a lake, with no less than 2 helicopters, out jump a bunch of men and women with assault rifles, and somehow even less subtly, a bunch of Hork-Bajir, which are the huge reptilian bladed shock troopers of the Yeerk invaders. After reporting back to his teammates, Tobias loops back around to continue gathering intel when an aircraft carrier-sized vessel basically flickers into existence above him. They all watch as it hovers over the lake and lowers these tubes and starts sucking up gallons and gallons and gallons of water. Now, this appears to be the first definitive weakness that they've come across. The ship is basically a huge tanker that they assume takes water from Earth, brings it up to the mothership in orbit. Which means, at the very least, Yeerks need water. Satisfied with his findings for the day, Tobias moves to rejoin the rest of the team, but after confusing a pack of actual wild wolves with them, and then struggling briefly with his hawk manatee, after spotting the female bird that he freed a few days ago, he managed to catch the time on one of the controller's watches. Yeah, the rest of the team's morph clock is up. Oh shit! Now this leads to a short but ultimately pointless scene in which Jake, Rachel, Cassie, and Marco get about halfway through their morph back to human, and then find themselves sort of stuck. There's panic, and they only really manage to resume their human forms through what appears to be sheer force of will. But as they rejoice at not being stuck as weird half-human wolves, Tobias is sort of forced to face the permanency of his situation, and he basically has a panic attack. He flies away and just leaves his friends behind. Hours of aimless flying later, Tobias decides he really should talk to somebody. Anybody. Well, Rachel. So he meets up with her in her bedroom, and she apologizes for maybe being a little bit insensitive earlier in the day, and while he is sympathetic to that, he uses the opportunity to address a larger issue. Lately, he has been feeling like maybe he's kind of losing himself to the hawk morph. Losing his connection to humanity. And Rachel basically tells him, tearfully, that as long as he has his friends, he's still connected, at least in that way. And so, when he leaves, he does feel a little bit touched, but he's still not so sure. After killing time for a while everybody's in school, Tobias meets up with the rest of the gang at Jake's house. Now, initial thinking is that they should blow up the tank ship and cut off the water supply to the Yeerk mothership. Marco, weirdly, suggests that what might be more impactful is just to find a way to frag the thing's cloaking device so that the entire city can see it, thus revealing the Yeerk invasion to essentially the world at large. Everyone agrees that might actually be a better idea, so they resolve to get on board that ship as fish. The meeting ends, everyone pretty much goes back to their normal lives. I guess Rachel has some gymnastics exhibition at the mall that she absolutely forbids Marco to attend. But seeing as how Tobias does not really have a normal life, he is tasked with going back up into the mountains and scouting out the lake and basically finding out as much as he possibly can about it. As he's on his way there and trying to think about the many advantages of being a hawk, he sort of spaces out for a little while, and when he comes to, he finds his beak stained with the blood of a newly eviscerated rat from the field below. Now, once again, Tobias freaks the fuck out. He impulsively flies to the mall where he knows that Rachel is performing, manages to slip in through an open door, and basically cruises around until he can find the only person in the world who seems to offer him even the slightest degree of comfort when things get way too existential. He zips past her while she's on the balance beam, and then I guess comes to his senses just long enough to realize, hey, wait a minute, I really shouldn't be doing this. And then he tries to escape through a skylight in the ceiling. Now that skylight, turns out, it's closed. So he hits it, plummets back to the ground. Rachel catches him, and in his weakened state, he basically just says that he's lost. He's lost the battle. He's lost himself to the hawk. He ate a rat. Who am I? And she says, no matter what happens, no matter how many rats you eat, as long as we're still friends, you're still in there. You're still a person. And I guess that's enough for him because he once again tries to escape through the skylight. And fortunately, this time, Marco, who wasn't even supposed to be there, happens to be standing by with a baseball, which he hurls at said skylight, shattering it and allowing Tobias to escape himself to the wild blue yonder. It's a pretty intense scene. Now, for the next few days, Tobias finds himself in something of a spiral, as we all do from time to time. He's basically resigned himself completely to his hawkdom. You know, sleeping outside, hunting, eviscerating, and eating small animals, as we all do from time to time. Think of it as a week of binge drinking, except instead of alcohol, his booze is being a fucking bird of prey. It's not until he stumbles upon another predator hunting its prey that he finally snaps out of it. A Hork-Bajir chasing a human through the woods. He realizes that he, Tobias, the human, not the hawk, could not perch idly by and watch the Yeerks take this stranger. So he uses his talons and slashes at the alien's face and guides the young man away from his stalker using thought speak. It really was the only way, and the guy clearly wasn't a controller, so whatever, I'll allow it. That night, Tobias reaches out to, of course, Rachel. There's a little light scolding, some apologizing, a little explaining, but Rachel is, as always, supportive, and Tobias realizes that maybe what he really needs to hold on to humanity is just to continue fighting for his fellow humans. The coming weekend, the team moves forward with the plan. They head into the mountains, Tobias hawking and the others wolfing. They find a cave in which to hide out, not expecting the Yeerk ship to arrive until later in the day, and from there they set to catching some fish, using fishing rods, which I guess they fashioned out of sticks or something? Yeah. In any case, after a few hours, it is, of course, Cassie who manages to snag a trout? Maybe? I'm not sure they ever actually say what kind of fish it is, but the point is, everybody acquires it, and then they return to their cave, where they just wait around for a while. Not like they could just sit around lakeside and wait for the Yeerks to show up, maybe with Tobias providing lookout. That would be stupid. So Tobias once again heads upstairs, so to speak. And sure enough, before long spots a line of jeeps winding their way up the trail. I guess a couple of helicopters swoop in over the tree line, and once the controllers have parked and or landed, as it may be, they sort of fan out through the woods, looking to take out any campers or would-be witnesses otherwise. And once they give the all clear, the huge truck ship, as the team is taken to calling it, sort of flickers into view out of nowhere, followed by a couple of bug fighters, followed by, you guessed it, Visser 3's blade ship. Dude loves to micromanage. In any case, Tobias had noticed that some of the controllers on the ground seemed a mite bit jumpy. I mean, they vaporized a deer just for being a deer. That's probably why. Tobias reports back to the team, alerting them to the Visser's presence and warning them that at this point, the plan to sneak down to the water's edge and morph there is far too risky. Marco agrees, but Jake and Rachel are hell-bent on exposing the Yeerks, and they're pretty convinced that this is the only way to do it. Cassie, lovely girl that she is, pitches an alternate plan. Each of them morphs individually into fish in the cave, and Tobias carries them to the water. Now, is this a good plan? I'll let you decide. But the answer's no. But, of course, it works. I mean, it's only book 3. The only minor snag is that he has to blow past a Hork-Bajir and a human controller that are blocking the cave entrance with the last fish. He manages to avoid the wrist blades and the Dracon beams, but at this point the Yeerks are definitely aware that there are, Andalites about. Anyway, from this point on, the team's fishy dealings are entirely relayed through their thought speech to Tobias. Jake goes up the suction tube first, just to make sure that everything's okay in there. Once inside, finding himself inside a rapidly filling enormous tank, he gives the go-ahead for everyone else to head up. Unfortunately, it's about this time that the Yeerks spot Tobias in an all-out dogfight, the Top Gun kind, not the Michael Vick kind, explodes into action. Bug fighters and helicopters take off and try to target the crafty bird, but as he is crafty, he simply parks himself aboard the oh-so-important truck ship and just kind of waits. They don't fire on him. The ship is way too valuable for that, but the Visser does try to provoke him into making some sort of tactical blunder through thought speech. But he just kind of chills. And it's about this time that Rachel reports in, telling him that everyone on board is still alive, but they can't get the grate at the top of the tank to open, so they're effectively trapped. I'm not really sure what she expected Tobias to do with that information, but good to know, I guess. Oh, she also takes advantage of this opportunity to ask Tobias to not allow them to be taken alive. if at all possible. So that's fun. Oh, and also, the ship is headed directly for the mothership in orbit, so everything's pretty much going to the proverbial shit. So, just as Tobias is beginning to find that fierceness in himself that we all find when we feel we have nothing left to lose, a bunch of taxons begin to climb out onto the truck ship so that they can engage him at close range. As the ugly space maggots surround him, he's forced to make a final gambit. He charges at one of the taxon's eyes, but at the last moment instead feints right and manages to grab its Dracon beam. He flies low toward the front of the ship so that the other ships can't fire on him, but as soon as he reaches the bridge, he lets fly with a continuous beam of apparently lightsaber-like Dracon fury. Evidently, this did enough, because while the ship is still ascending, it begins spinning wildly out of control. It smashes into one of the helicopters, and then into one of the bug fighters, and it's as Tobias is trying to get out of range of this wildly out-of-control vessel that he notices the huge gash in the ship's tank. Thousands upon thousands of gallons of water come pouring out, and before long, Tobias watches as his fully human friends come pouring out with it. All seems lost. The fall will absolutely kill them. But, of course, as they're careening toward oblivion, they all manage to morph into birds just in time and escape. They hide in the woods from the Visser's blade ship, but Tobias gets to watch as the Lady Hawk from earlier is fired upon in a poignant moment that really only has true emotional impact for those of us who have spent any amount of time relating to raptors. Still, it's kinda sad. The book ends on a final visit to Rachel's window, wherein Tobias explains that while he's realized that he is still very definitely a human, he is also a hawk. And he's learned, or at least accepted, that one way or another he will need to learn to live with that duality. So that's it. I know I said that book 2 was probably the most emotional of the 6 books that I'd reread at that point, but this one definitely packs a little punch too. The Visitor tells the emotional story of a side character that we get to experience through Rachel's eyes. It's more extroverted, but still very relatable. This story, on the other hand, while still being relatable, is much more introspective. On the few occasions that I've discussed Animorphs with my adult friends over the years, well before I started making these videos, at least 2 of them, shout out to Katie and Will, love you, have claimed that Tobias is their favorite character. Now, I never disliked Tobias, but I always just kind of remembered him as the token outcast. I hadn't read this book in 20 years, and I'd basically forgotten every detail of the story, and as an adult, the plot still seems kind of silly to me, but Tobias's experience, as a character that can be appreciated but can never really be understood, well, as a socially awkward, irritatingly self-aware year-old, I can definitely summon up a modicum of sympathy for the kid. I still like book 2 better. But that's probably just a matter of personal taste. Once you can get past all of the terrible decisions made in this book.